When you think of Japan, what is the first thing that comes to mind? You might think of a modern and advanced country with a rich culture, or sushi. Many will also think of manga, video games, or samurai. Basically, you'll likely have a very, very positive image of the land of the rising sun. However, as you know, all countries have their positives and they have their negatives. Therefore, in this video here on VisualPolitik, we're going to talk about a subject that very few media outlets talk about, and that's Japan's historical revisionism. But what exactly does that mean? See, we could say that revisionism is the denial of historical events, usually negative of course, that happened in the past.
So let's see what kind of people these Japanese really are.
Many countries that have hard to digest past strive to hide the truth or try and change the official version of events. And Japan, definitely one of them. Let's turn this around a bit. When we think of Japan and its history, what comes to mind? Probably samurai, geishas, perhaps the double nuclear attack from the United States, or the Pearl Harbor attack, well, at least because of the movie. To us, knowing about these events is normal. But folks, do we really know how the Japanese Empire was at the height of its power? Do you know exactly what this means for the Far East? Why do you think that the countries that Japan victimized, such as China and Korea, still are very susceptible to this issue? Well, listen up.
The Japanese Empire, the Empire of Terror.
You heard that right. During the first half of the 20th century, and especially during the 30s and 40s, Japan was an imperialist power that dedicated itself to invading its neighbors as if there was no tomorrow, and they did so with no hint of mercy. And when we say without mercy, we mean it. They were truly inhumane. Throughout those years, Japanese troops committed some of the most heinous abuses to human integrity, life, and identity that could ever be imagined. Almost all of the worst things we could imagine a country doing, Japan did. We're talking about terrible things like enslaving people to work in Japan's industries and mining, enslaving women to work in brothels and on the war fronts, not to mention the Unit 731 Squad experiments in which they used living people to conduct chemical weapon experiments. In the Chinese city of Nanjing alone, in barely 2 months, the Japanese killed 300,000 people and abused more than 80,000 women. It's truly a shocking history. Once it invaded a country, the Japanese Empire forcibly imposed its culture, its language, and Japan's political and legal system. It even forced people to change their names. As you can see, we're talking about a dark era of uncontrolled and unlimited fear, atrocities, and violence. The soldiers and the officers, they could do as they wished. As a result of all of this, at least 20 million people in Asia lost their lives at the hands of the Japanese Empire. 20 million people. In fact, the data on the Japanese army's lack of scruples during the war will give you goosebumps. Check this out. 40% of American prisoners of war who fell into the hands of the Japanese didn't survive. 40%. To give you an idea, that number in Europe, less than 2%. And don't think that this was a coincidence. Not at all. The explanation lies in the ancient Japanese culture known as Bushido, a culture that despises soldiers who surrender in combat. This also explains why the Japanese soldiers were so famous for fighting until the very end. But having said that, let's close the history book. Since Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's rise to power in 2012, Japan has surprised the world with a revision and denial policy of its history that is truly disturbing. But what does it consist of? What is Shinzo Abe doing to change or sugarcoat the story? Are today's Japanese really aware of their past? Well, listen up.
Shinzo Abe, revisionism in the institutions.
Shinzo Abe is already a well-known face.
Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and the distinct honor of presenting to you His Excellency Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister of Japan.
He's been running Japan since 2012 and is famous particularly because of his economic policy program, better known as Abenomics.
Back in June 1957, Nobusuke Kishi, my grandfather, standing right here as Prime Minister of Japan.
Now, there is a much more controversial aspect to Shinzo Abe that isn't mentioned much in the West. Abe is an openly convinced revisionist. And the truth is that he's always been one. Since he first entered the Daito, Japan's parliament, in 1993, Abe has promoted laws and reforms that seek to sugarcoat how the history of the Japanese Empire is shown to society. For example, in his first and brief term as Prime Minister between September 2006 and September 2007, Abe approved a fundamental law of education reform to establish a more patriotic vision with more traditionalist moral values in the Japanese education system. That is, pure nationalism in the education system. And not just that, Shinzo Abe himself is a member of the Nippon Kaigi, a Japanese ultranationalist group founded in 1997 that openly defends historical revisionism to exculpate the Japanese Empire from its crimes. Basically, it's kind of like if Angela Merkel belonged to an ultra-radical far-right group in Germany. Wouldn't really be cool. But do you think Abe hides his involvement? Not at all.
U.S. textbook skews history, Prime Minister of Japan says.
In fact, guys, Prime Minister Abe not only modified the Japanese education law to change educational content, but openly criticizes how Japan's history is addressed in other countries. Basically, he makes no effort to conceal his bias.
Abe's revisionism nets own goals at home and away.
The Japanese Prime Minister even attacked the McGraw-Hill publishing house for the description that they made of how Japan forced women to prostitute themselves on the war front. Women who, for him and the revisionists, were nothing more than volunteers who earned a lot of money, although all historical evidence does show that they were slaves.
I just looked at a document, McGraw-Hill's textbook, and I was shocked. This kind of textbook is being used in the United States, and we did not protest the things we should have, or we failed to correct the things we should have. Shinzo Abe, Japan's Prime Minister.
And this wasn't an isolated case. Abe's Japan began when he started implementing the most extreme revisionism in the institutions, driven by the ultra-nationalist group Nippon Kaigi. In his speech during the 70th anniversary of Japan's surrender, Abe, citing the 3 million who died in the Japanese Empire, extolled their sacrifices and called them valuable. At the very same event, by the way, the then Emperor Akihito also spoke. He, of course, is Hirohito's son, the emperor who attacked Pearl Harbor and unleashed many wars across Asia. Well, in contrast to Shinzo Abe, Akihito was somewhat more embarrassed by his country's revisionist inclination.
Our country today enjoys peace and prosperity, thanks to the ceaseless efforts made by the people of Japan toward recovery from the devastation of war and toward development, always backed by their earnest desire for the continuation of peace. Emperor Akihito.
It's curious that the emperor himself has a much more conciliatory speech than the prime minister regarding the empire's past. And there is more. Both Shinzo Abe and many of his party's ministers, deputies, and senators regularly visit or send offerings to the Yasukuni Shrine. Yasukuni, folks, is a Shinto shrine where 14 Class A war criminals from the Japanese Empire, among others, are honored. War criminals that were declared as such in the Tokyo trials, the Japanese equivalent to the Nuremberg trials for the Nazis. But if you think this is all a matter of speeches, words, and visits to controversial places, well, you're very, very mistaken. Listen up.
The dream of controlling education.
That's right, it's no secret. Every ruler who aspires to change history for better or for worse needs to influence education. We already mentioned that Abe modified the educational law for this purpose, but he did not stop there. One of his government's biggest scandals was that of the Osaka Moritomo Gakuen Nursery School. You see, this is a private kindergarten school which has an ultra-nationalist ideology. Yep, a nursery school with an ultra-nationalist ideology. It indoctrinates children in the purest Japanese empire style. They even made them memorize the so-called Imperial Rescript on Education of 1890 every day, a kind of manifesto with the empire's principles. All for kids who are 5 and 6 years old. Hold on a second, what does Shinzo Abe have to do with any of this? Well, in addition to publicly stating that he shared the vision of the director, Abe and his wife, who by the way was named honorary director of the nursery, were immersed in a donations and favoritism scandal where public land was sold to benefit the nursery. The corruption scandal almost brought down Abe's government, although he managed to remain standing in the end. But besides the imperialist nursery scandal, there's a kind of historical whitewash throughout Japan's entire educational system. History teacher Tamaki Matsuoka, famous for having gotten 250 former soldiers from the time of the Japanese Empire to admit to multiple war crimes, is an expert in analyzing how Japan's past is tackled in modern schools. Matsuoka accuses the government of deliberately silencing the most negative historical events of the Japanese Empire. For example, in the textbooks that students use in schools, only one footnote is dedicated to the Nanking Massacre, which we talked about at the beginning of this video. And you know, I would kind of think that an event with 300,000 victims is probably enough for a bit of a proper placement in a history book, wouldn't you think? But the fact that this is happening raises an essential question. What effects could this historical silencing have? Guys, even though here on VisualPolitik we don't really like looking too far back, ignoring such an important part of history can be dangerous when making political decisions, especially in a region of the world that has so many national feelings. To make matters worse, movies, books, and series that the Japanese government itself promotes feed this idea of changing people's vision of the past. I'm referring to works such as The Eternal Zero, a film that highlights the importance of the kamikaze pilots. This growing nationalism, along with the political and commercial confrontations that have been registered in this area of the world, help explain the growing suspicion with which young Japanese people have begun looking at their neighbors. Sociological studies state that today 80% of Japanese people have a bad image of China and 60% of South Korea, and that's obviously not a good thing. So after knowing all of this, what do you think about how Japan is dealing with its past? Do you think it could have consequences? Maybe Japan should learn from Germany about facing up to its history. Well, leave your answers in the comments below, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did. Don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, as always, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you next video.
Back in June 1957, Nobusuke Kishi, my grandfather,